Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Someone had asked me recently if they should hire a fractional COO or a full-time COO. And honestly, my answer was that you're asking the wrong question. So often I find in these types of situations that we are looking to fill a predefined role. And this is probably true beyond the COO conversation, but it's this idea that we're hiring for a predefined role because that's what we believe we need in terms of, filling out our org chart, or as we're growing, filling this specific gap. But for me, what it really comes down to, the way I answered this question for this particular person was, well, what problem are we trying to solve, right? So many of the conversations I've been having lately center around this central idea of the problem. And I think this one is no different for the reason that I already stated, but it's just this idea of, depending on the size org you're in, and depending on obviously the role you're sitting in, right? The COO title or role is going to be different, right? It's going to be different at a company that's only doing $800,000 in revenue compared to a company doing $8 million in revenue compared to a company doing 18, 80, and 800, right? So you have to understand where are we at today? Where are we trying to go, right? And that starts to help uncover this issue of, what problem are we trying to solve, right? The challenge is when you have this predefined role or idea of, what you're trying to do. Generally what happens, especially in smaller companies, is you make compromises around, who you can ultimately hire to bring in and, help you solve this problem of where you're trying to go, right? But we don't unpack it from that really deep level. We continue to keep it surface level. And so therefore, we're not really trying to identify people that have either, lived through the experience we're trying to recreate or get to, right? If we're trying to go from 8 to 18 million, but our budget only allows us to hire somebody that's run or, been responsible for a $3 million a year organization, right? Probably going to struggle to get from 8 to 18 quickly, right? You have to understand what are the levers that we can pull, where are we at today? Again, what's the problem we're actually trying to solve for versus just saying, oh, I need a COO. I need a VP of, XYZ, right? So that's kind of the starting point for today's conversation. And just as a reminder for anybody that's new here, each one of the solo episodes is an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So would highly encourage you to check that out. Free to subscribe, can absolutely unsubscribe if you're not getting any value out of it. But you can find all that info out on the website. So, kind of that takes me into the next part of this equation in terms of, hey, we maybe need a skill set that we can't necessarily afford. Well, that's where this really attractive idea of a fractional COO comes in. And that's how most people that are, selling that, right, have positioned it, right? It's, hey, you get all of this skill set at a reduced price. And, what I've seen with this is that it's kind of been, especially over the last handful of years, there's been this explosion of fractional from a pure marketing perspective, right? Like people calling themselves fractional, literally everything. I mean, you can find fractional anybody these days. And, some of these folks, sure, they've got a very extensive background and, it's a good fit for a variety of reasons. Fractional XYZ from a traditional sense are folks that are, sitting in your org chart, right? They're responsible for day to day. They typically have some set amount of hours that they've committed to your organization, and they generally will only have one, maybe two or three at absolute most folks that they're, clients that they're doing this within, because obviously you can't be full on integrated into, 10, 15, 100 businesses, right? So there is a limit to it. But the big issue that I see with this is understanding, again, what problem are we trying to solve, and then identifying if you're going to look on the outside, right, and not bring in a full-time hire, identifying some folks that have the lens of experience that will help you to solve the problem you're trying to solve. So again, for me, everything comes back to this central idea of what problem are we trying to solve? And, the vast majority of companies that are let's say, in the SMB space and growing are already going to have somebody that's sitting in this type of role, right? Now, maybe they don't have this exact title, maybe they are some other level of operations leadership, but the central idea is that you've got somebody that is trying to, both be, depending again on the size of your company, but both be strategic and tactical. And then as you grow, so let's say you go from 8 to 18 to 80 million, right? Like obviously where that kind of COO level person sits strategically is going to change. So that's some value that folks that have kind of, this width and depth of experience can come along and sit beside those folks that are already integrated into your organization and to help expand their lens, right? Because typically those folks that are within the org, especially call it, sub probably 50, maybe 75, 100 million, but definitely probably sub 50 million. Chances are that most of those folks have only been in, maybe 1 to 5, I'd say on the really high end, other organizations, right? Typically, I would say it's going to be like 1 to 3 organizations, with many of them only being in that one company, right? They've kind of grown up there. They've ascended the leadership ranks, if you will. So that's where there is a lot of value in having somebody kind of come along and sit alongside those folks and expand their lens of experience, in a kind of truncated manner, right? But the big problem I see is that so many folks that don't have that, width or depth of experience are calling themselves fractional. And really what, kind of what they're trying to do is get more into like a retainer type of model without necessarily having to provide, the same level of value that you would kind of expect. So what typically ends up happening, churn, right, ends up happening. And then, for a lot of folks that kind of, discredits or leaves, a bad taste in their mouth in terms of, this, where these types of folks sit and, ultimately, the value that can be derived. Right. So, I've kind of unpacked a bit about, the problems, right? So it's like, all right, great. So it's like, if it's not fractional COO, it's not full-time COO, it's like, what do people need, right? And so I talked about this a little bit, and it's really the model that, that I've kind of come to be in, really through a bunch of different iterations of my, of my own business. And that's not to say this is a sales pitch for working with me. But I do think that, for somebody that has a significant amount of experience, kind of both width and depth, that there is this model that I've kind of, coined the term, this operations on demand. But there is a model where allows people with, an immense amount of experience to come alongside the folks that are already existing in these orgs and to, again, help them expand their lens of experience, right? I tell my clients all the time, like, look, you guys can totally do this stuff, right? That's how I learned how to do it. It's as long as you have the time available. So in my case, it's taken me nearly 30 years of, doing this work daily to understand what are the levers, how do we move further faster, right? How do we not just define the problem, but how do we prioritize, like resources or things that could potentially solve that problem? How do we unpack the actual root cause versus just chasing after all the symptoms? Like, I just learned it by doing. That's the literal truth of the matter, right? So it's like, if you have 30 years and you have, millions of dollars of capital to throw at it, knock yourself out, right? Like, guaranteed you will learn some stuff along the way. But if you're looking to try to shortcut that, if you're looking to, get the operational infrastructure in place to kind of grow exponentially, what better way than to expand your lens of experience, working with or collaborating with somebody who's been there, somebody who's done it, somebody who's continuing to do it, somebody who continues to, learn and educate themselves, right? Somebody who's expanded their network, right? All of those things. I'm not saying I'm the only person out here doing this. Certainly other folks that are either, equally as wide and or deep, or that are a little bit narrower, but significantly deeper, right? So again, it all comes back to me for what's the problem we're trying to solve and who's best suited to help us get, from A to B. So that's not saying I am uniquely positioned to do that, right? I tell people all the time, hey, let me introduce you to so-and-so. They are somebody you probably need to talk to when it comes to, this particular thing, right? So one of my favorite, kind of ways to illustrate this, and there's a bunch of different versions of this story, right? But it's this story of the, maybe you've heard this version of it, but it's this story of, the broken down ship in the shipyard, and, all of the best mechanics went to look at this thing, couldn't get the engines running again. And after some time and a bunch of trial and error, somebody had recommended this old timer who had been around for a really long time. And, sure enough, they came to the shipyard. They, kind of took a look at the engine, walked around it a couple of times, and, went to their repair bag, pulled out a ball peen hammer, walked back over to the engine, felt around a little bit, and then, gave it one little tap, and the engine sprang to life, right? And so, obviously everybody in the shipyard was super excited. They got this thing running again, so on and so forth. So, a bit of time passes, the shipyard gets the invoice, and it's, $15,000. And, shipyard person that's processing the invoice is outraged, right? Like, how could this cost me so much money? You were here for, 20 minutes and all you did was tap the engine, one time, and then you were out of here. And so they, requested a breakdown of the invoice. And, so the old timer responded back and said, tapping engine with hammer, $1, experience to know when to tap, how hard to tap, and where to tap, $14,999. Right. And it's one of my favorite stories, only from the perspective of, again, a lot of this stuff takes time. I've shared this plenty of times, but, I was very fortunate to not only grow up in a company that gave me a variety of opportunities, to physically relocate and be kind of on the ground floor, doing these transformations and, growing businesses, right? But then I got to travel and do that with other companies that were being acquired and their leadership teams. So I got this really unique perspective. I also got to travel to, other sister facilities and other facilities kind of in the network to learn from them. And so I just got this tremendous opportunity to kind of learn by really, again, making mistakes, right? I've shared this, but, I wasn't a great leader in those early days for a variety of reasons. I was a young guy, thought I knew more stuff than I did. Didn't recognize the value of talking to the people, kind of the first degree, direct and indirect influencers or stakeholders for a variety of different things, right? It took me a really long time to learn the importance of that. It took me a really long time to understand that a lot of the ways I was trying to solve problems were surface level. I was chasing symptoms. I wasn't, solving for root causes. It took me a really long time to learn that you have to proactively test, meaning, right, you have to intentionally introduce failure into these systems that are being built and developed to understand if your, preventative and corrective measures are effective or not, right? So that's the years of doing, right? And again, that all of those different iterations, all of those different, trial and error, all those different things that I learned, you just amass this significant lens with which to, unpack what is actually happening underneath the surface of kind of what it seems, right? And so when you're talking to leadership folks who have been in this particular operation or organization, right, for some period of time, it's easy to start to unpack all of those, different layers, right? And again, that's the value that somebody like myself, can bring into an organization. So another great way to think about this same problem, right? And I use this one a lot as well, but, it's kind of specific to, let's say, like technology. So a lot of folks will think like one that's easily relatable, right? Regardless of if you're in a service-based business or a manufacturing business. But, let's take CRMs, right? Kind of everybody has some level of a CRM, even small companies that are working in Excel, right? But the bigger you get, the kind of, closer you get to probably some, industry recognizable names, right? So feel free to switch these around, and it's no slam on either one of these companies, right? But the whole point is that a company, let's say, that has implemented HubSpot as their CRM, may struggle with, let's say, adoption issues across their sales infrastructure, or maybe getting their operations team to be involved in that platform for a variety of reasons. Could be workflow related, could be information sharing, right? Cross-functionally, what have you. And so when I'm in a lot of these conversations, I'll hear things like, HubSpot just doesn't work for us, right? But I got a demo of Salesforce, and I think that's actually exactly what we need. And the big issue here is that, like, if you're already in that mindset, right, no matter what seat you sit in an org, but if you're already in that mindset, and let's say you're a HubSpot customer and you go and approach Salesforce, Salesforce is going to confirm that bias, right? Of course, they're going to say, yeah, HubSpot's garbage. Right now, they're going to use some different language. They're going to say, they've had a lot of their clients move from HubSpot into Salesforce for XYZ reasons, right? But they're going to confirm that bias. And the underlying issue that I find, probably like 95 plus times out of 100, right, is it has something to do with the planning people and process, right? So it comes down to the understanding of, it comes down to the configuration and implementation, right, of that specific tool, not necessarily the tool itself. Now, I get this pushback and kind of argument of like, well, sometimes there are tool advancements, right, that are different. Sure, I totally agree with that, right? But generally speaking, that's not what is driving a lot of these changes. What's driving the majority of the changes have to do with configuration and implementation, which really is just a fancy way of saying, like it is planning, people, process related, right? It has something to do with the adoption, it has something to do with the fact that it's not effective, right? In terms of delivering on some sort of output that is actionable. And so, the conversation when I'm having it quickly switches from let's put a pause on the tool A, tool B. Let's better understand the planning, people, process aspect. And then we can start to unpack, what's the better solution here, right? Is it what's already existing and what we've paid for? Or is it something that we need to do in terms of that operational infrastructure that's going to better position us for a more successful configuration and implementation of a new, tool. So that's, again, another way to say the same thing, right? What's the problem we're actually solving? So, some of you that are listening to this may be thinking, okay, like, this sounds like a lot of what I've got going on. It's like, how do I figure out like what I actually need? It's one of the problems I had to try to solve for when I was building out my business. The idea is, how do you crawl, walk, run with people, right? Again, how do you start to unpack all of the different layers of the onion? And for me, that starts with, either our free operations diagnostic or our current state sprint, right? Current state sprint is a paid diagnostic. But the whole point is to get to this point where we're crawl, walk, run, right? Let's really understand the problem. Let's really understand all of the different opportunities. Let's really understand the resources that we have. Let's really understand where we're trying to go with this particular business, right? Are we trying to, go from 8 million to 18 to 80? Are we trying to, stay at 8 million, right? Like, we got to understand what we're trying to do before we can start to, dial into what the actual problem is. And two, start to, put some thoughts and prioritization around like, what do those efforts look like to ultimately get from, from A to B. So that was a lot to unpack about this topic. Happy to answer any follow-up questions. If you happen to have any, feel free to, find me on LinkedIn, connect with me there. You can shoot me a note via our website. There's an interactive chat widget. There's all kinds of different ways to reach out, and really appreciate you listening and tuning in to each one of these solo episodes. Stay tuned for, some really great stuff this year. I've got a couple of really incredible series that we are in production with right now that I'm really excited to get out. So those are going to be still live within the podcast. They'll be, with kind of industry expert guests. And we're doing some series work to kind of unpack some bigger concepts, over a number of different episodes instead of trying to jam everything into one. Usually the guest episodes run, 30, 40 minutes. So instead of trying to unpack a complex topic, in one episode, we're trying to expand out, really deliver a ton of, insights and value to that. So kind of stay tuned and subscribed to catch those out. And we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.